Do not insult this collapse by calling it the end. What is happening to you is far more ruthless and far more sacred than that. Life is not simply wounding you, it is tearing down the inner architecture built on fear, performance, and borrowed identities. The hardest season did not arrive to erase your existence. It arrived to strip your soul of everything that could not survive the truth. That is why ordinary distractions suddenly feel dead in your hands. You stare at the ceiling, unlock your phone, scroll without hunger, reopen old messages, revisit old humiliations, and still nothing touches the place that aches. You call it failure because you do not yet have language for this kind of emptiness. But emptiness is not always punishment. Sometimes it is the first room God clears when He intends to rebuild you from the center. The dark night of the soul is not just sadness with spiritual vocabulary. It is the bankruptcy of the old self and the collapse of the way you used to manufacture meaning. It begins when what once soothed you no longer reaches you, when your usual escapes lose flavor, when your personality stops protecting you from your own abyss. The Sufis understood this with terrifying clarity. There comes a point when consolation disappears, so dependence on consolation can die with it. It is waking up to the brutal fact that much of what you called me was organized fear, decorated attachment, and need disguised as love. It is seeing that your confidence often hid panic, that your devotion sometimes carried negotiation, that your goodness was not always free of secret hunger. That realization is humiliating, and yet humiliation can become holy when it crushes the lie without destroying the soul. This is why the pain feels intelligent. It is not randomly attacking your life. It is finding the exact places where you built your world around control, approval, fantasy, and self-protection. It reaches into the hidden chambers, the need to be chosen, the need to be remembered, the need to feel exceptional, the need to be right about your own story. Then it touches them all at once. No wonder it feels like your whole inner world is on fire. You think you are breaking because you no longer enjoy what used to numb you. But what is collapsing is not your entire life. It is the identity you used to avoid the void. The version of you that knew how to stay busy, desirable, useful, admired, spiritually impressive, emotionally unavailable, or endlessly needed is losing oxygen. And that loss feels like death, because the false self always interprets exposure as annihilation. This is why your body joins the crisis. You wake up exhausted, sleep without restoration, carry a pressure in your chest that does not always become tears, feel hollowness in your stomach that food cannot solve. You are tired in ways that do not match your schedule because the fatigue is not only physical, it is structural. It is the exhaustion of holding up an identity that no longer has permission to rule you. Even your relationships begin to change their texture. People who once felt easy now feel loud. Conversations sound thin. Advice starts to scrape against your nerves, and rehearsed positivity becomes almost unbearable. You worry that you are becoming cold, distant, difficult, impossible to love. But many times, it is not coldness at all. It is the soul losing its tolerance for noise while being forced into a more honest kind of listening. You try to pray and feel nothing. You try to work and your limbs feel heavy. You try to explain yourself and nobody seems able to reach the room where you are actually drowning. That silence terrifies you because you assume absence means abandonment. But in the deeper Sufi reading, there are moments when God removes sweetness so you stop worshipping sweetness instead of truth. Rumi circles this mystery again and again. Divine love does not first flatter the image you built of yourself. It breaks what in you has grown dependent on appearance. It wrecks the false center that keeps demanding reassurance, and then it waits while your soul learns how to breathe without pretending. That is why the path feels cruel before it feels clear. Love is not always gentle at the beginning. sometimes it enters like demolition. And the reason this phase feels more severe than anything before it is because your suffering has changed its target. Earlier, you suffered to get something back, a person, a future, a role, a sense of certainty, a version of yourself you once could recognize. Now the pain is deeper because it is not only taking something from outside your life, it is dismantling the false center around which your entire life was arranged. That kind of loss scrambles faith, desire, identity, motivation, and even your sense of time. You start seeing things you were never meant to keep ignoring. How often you gave love to secure attachment. How often you chased healing so you could return stronger, shinier, and more admired. How often your generosity still wanted witness, return, gratitude, or emotional leverage. How often even your spiritual hunger was contaminated by the wish to become someone superior to your own pain. That sight is hard to survive without turning against yourself. Because once the masks begin falling, the temptation is to replace illusion with self-hatred. But that is just the ego changing costumes and pretending it has become profound. Real awakening is not self-worship, but it is also not self-crucifixion. It is the fierce middle ground where you look clearly, refuse to lie, and still do not abandon the soul that is trying to be born. This is where many people retreat. Not in the beginning, when everything is dramatic and obvious, but here, in the quiet stage where lucidity becomes relentless. You start recognizing your subtle manipulations, your hidden vanity, your emotional bargaining, your appetite for centrality, your refined forms of control. And if you are not careful, that knowledge becomes poison instead of purification. Because seeing the false is not the same as knowing how to let it die with grace. The Sufi masters never pointed toward a decorated ego with better manners. They pointed toward a displacement of the center, a movement from the demanding self toward presence, essence, surrender, and the naked soul before God. Attar, Rumi, and the entire lineage of inner burning understood that this passage costs far more than comfort. It costs your favorite illusions about who you are. It costs the throne from which fear has been governing your life under the name of self. That is why love itself begins to mutate inside you. At first, you wanted love to fill the vacancy, to soothe the terror, to rescue you from abandonment, to make your emptiness stop echoing. But the dark night exposes how much of that longing was still panic wearing perfume. It shows you how often you called it love when it was dependence on confirmation. And little by little, the heart starts wanting truth more than sedation. You also begin to lose your spiritual impatience. You wanted to understand quickly, heal quickly, rise quickly, return to peace quickly, transform your fall into a beautiful testimony before you had even faced what was dying. But this descent refuses performance. It keeps you in the dark long enough to expose the way you used light as an escape. And that is why the ego hates the process. It wants elevation, while the soul wants honesty, even at the price of everything false. The loneliness of this season is almost impossible to explain, not because nobody loves you, but because very few people have language for this kind of dismantling. You try to describe the void, and they offer entertainment. You try to name the death happening inside, and they hand you motivational slogans. But no generic encouragement can walk through the burning center of you where the old life is losing authority. And then another brutal truth appears. Much of your suffering came from fighting reality itself. Not only from loss, rejection, disappointment, or absence, but from the furious demand that life obey your image of how it should have unfolded. You wanted the person to stay, the time to return, the wound to make sense quickly, the reward to come on schedule, God to answer in your preferred language. When that demand is exposed, pain changes shape. It stops being only what happened to me and becomes what in me kept warring against what is. that shift is devastating because lucidity cuts deeper than comfort. It shows you how often you are trying to negotiate with truth, asking reality to bend just enough so you would not have to surrender. And when that negotiation finally fails, the old self panics. It calls the experience meaningless, cruel, unfair, unbearable. But sometimes unbearable is simply the name the ego gives to a truth it can no longer control. The hardest phase of your life is leading you toward final awakening because it is teaching you how to remain alive without false support. That sounds simple until every borrowed pillar starts disappearing. A person fails, a fantasy fades, a plan collapses, a habit stops working, a distraction loses power, a promise no longer sedates you, and suddenly you feel like you are dropping through open air. But that drop may be the place where illusion finally loses its grip. The ego would rather keep a familiar misery than enter a freedom it cannot manage. And here is the deepest fracture of all. Final awakening does not come to improve the character. It comes to relocate the center of your existence. You stop living entirely from hunger, defense, reaction, proving, chasing, clinging, explaining, performing, and trying to secure your worth from the outside. Something quieter and more real begins to breathe underneath the wreckage. Not perfection, not permanent peace, not a holy image, just a truer center that no longer feeds on the same lies. When that new center begins to stir, even in weakness, everything changes. You may still cry in the shower, still freeze in the middle of your room, still feel lost when you imagine the future, still grieve the identities that can no longer be worn. But beneath the confusion, there is a new kind of gravity. You are no longer only trying to survive the pain. You are starting to understand that the pain came carrying a blade, and the blade came with purpose. So stop calling every inner death a disaster. Some things in you are not being murdered, they are being revoked. Some structures are not collapsing because you failed, but because they were built around a center that could never carry the weight of a real life. This is why the old commands no longer work, why your usual impulses no longer rule, why your inner world refuses to answer to yesterday's authority. The throne is shaking because the imposter has been exposed, and that is the secret hidden inside this brutal season. The dark night did not come only to make you suffer. It came to remove the false centrality that kept the real from breathing, the performance that kept presence buried, the addiction to control that kept surrender impossible. It came to pull you out of the wrong place by force, because you would never have left it voluntarily. So the real question is no longer why everything feels like it is ending. The real question is this: now that the lie is losing its voice, now that the mask can no longer hold, now that the old center is cracking open under the weight of truth, what in you is still begging to survive that was never meant to remain?